Good morning, everybody. This is Hilary Stupa. I'm a developer with Qdabra software, and this is our Thursday weekly webinar. So happy Thursday, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about accessing the Microsoft Graph API from Flow. So you may or may not be familiar with the Graph API. That's fine. I just want to make sure you learn about it a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some of the things we need to do to be able to access it from Flow. I believe these are also points that would be true if you were accessing it from Logic Apps. I know last week we were talking about using Logic Apps instead of Flow in some circumstances. So, you know, this should work the same way in Flow as it does here. Logic Apps as it does here. So today, the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the Graph API Explorer. So I think any of us who have worked with SharePoint web services have in the past, punched URLs into the browser and hit go. And that works okay for trying to figure out your gets. Doesn't work so well for posting data, of course. And some of you might be familiar with tools like Fiddler or Postman. The Graph API Explorer is actually a really great tool that Microsoft has provided that allows us to just go ahead and test things. So we'll take a look at how to use that. Whoops, I hit ahead too fast. Point two, my colleague Kirby made this pretty slide deck for me, and it's got animations that I'm not used to. So the second thing we'll do is we have to create an Azure AD application to allow us to connect to the Graph API. Again, if you were at the Logic Apps webinar the other week, you'll have seen that the Azure dashboard is unfamiliar, maybe because you maybe haven't used it, but it's not scary as long as you know where to find things and understand that, like so many of the new things Microsoft has been unveiling, it is a changing environment. So you can't always, if you're looking at documentation that somebody wrote up in 2018, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt and maybe try to search around a little for the same things. So don't get too hung up on UI changes. They're going to happen. And then finally, we're going to create a basic flow that leverages some Graph API services. I kept this bullet really vague because, frankly, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to show you. I had a flow that I'd done to work out a question for a client that involved looping through all of the users in an organization and getting their contacts. And so that was kind of where this stemmed from. But then I started thinking about it yesterday, and I was like, I think I have a compelling use case. And so I actually have another flow that I think is a little more compelling. And what this new flow does is it runs on a schedule, checks a leave request list, and if you're approved for a leave request that starts that day, it sets up your out of office automatic reply for you. So that may be more control than some people want, but it does show how to do a patch and adjust the user's mailbox settings. So do hang out for that flow review, because there's some authentication gotchas that I want to make sure you know about, just in case you get into the Graph API and you want to be able to do some patch or post from Flow or Logic Apps, okay? And I don't want you to have the surprises I had yesterday, because I had lots of surprises. All right, so what's the Graph API? It's everything. No, it's not everything. It's a lot of things. So the available data includes stuff like OneNote and OneDrive and SharePoint and Planner and Outlook and Teams, trending insights. We'll take a quick look at some of these things in the Explorer. And it's kind of intended to be an easy place for developers to access this Microsoft cloud ecosystem, okay? Now, one thing to note is that when we start looking around, you're going to see a lot of stuff that's beta. And that's just because there is a beta version of the Graph API as well. So just kind of keep an eye out on that when you're looking at documentations in the Graph Explorer, and I'll show you that here in a second. So, discovering the methods, you can use the Graph Explorer to test various calls. You can use sample queries that are available to you in the Graph Explorer to kind of get over that initial learning curve. And then finally, there is rich documentation that you can leverage to help you sort of expand your understanding from there. Some of which I had to leverage yesterday, and some of which I'll show you today, so you kind of get a sense of what this documentation looks like and how you can use it. I mean, obviously I've said this 100 times before in these webinars. That was my my biggest hump going from English major to developer was learning how to read and understand this technical documentation. So if you can just, stubborn your way through it, if it's not something you're accustomed to, it's extremely helpful. So we're going to take a look at that documentation and how to really get the hang of it. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over here to the Graph Explorer. I wanted to split this kind of up and demo as I went, just because I think it makes more sense that way than hanging on to everything. All right, so this is the Graph Explorer. You can see I'm signed in right now. I'm signed into a dev site that I created for this. There's lots of links for you guys in the slides, so be sure you download the presentation. The Microsoft makes it really easy for you to set up a dev site. And I would encourage you, if you're going to do some development, to do that. Now, for me, my issue is that we don't use Office 365 for our email. And because of that, there's certain things that I wanted to try with the Graph API that I couldn't. And so I created my own little dev site in order to try these things. Now, when you first get to the Graph Explorer, it's going to look like this, right? Because you aren't signed in until you click the sign in button. However, they've got sample queries right here based on some sample data. And you can see this is defaulting to get, and you can't change the request type unless you're logged in, because they're not going to let you patch or post to the sample data. You can see that this is v1.0, which is the default. It can be changed to beta. I did find that when you change that to beta, the URL does not change to beta. No, you must type that in yourself, okay? The beta version is, as it says, it's a beta version. It's stuff that's coming. Unless you have a compelling reason to use it, unless there's something in beta that you can't get otherwise, I would recommend that you skip beta and just use v1. Okay, so, but just so you know, if you want to try beta, you can, but you will have to manually kind of switch this back and forth, and the difference in the URL is just v1.0. Okay, so if I'm not signed in, and I click something like get all the items in my drive or something like that, you can see down here, here's our response. And none of this is real data. This is all just whatever they have set up in order to provide you with something coming back. Now, once you've signed in, and I think this is my actual one, once you've signed in, you can see here I am. I want you to notice that modify permissions link. We have across the top the Graph Explorer, which is where we are right now. There's a getting started link here, some stuff there. The docs are right there. The API reference is right there. So some of those things, because I'm not super sharp, I didn't pick up on those to start with, and I was constantly searching for these things. So I wanted to make sure you knew about those. Another place you can go, this is the initial documentation landing point, and it's got some great places where you can kind of click around and see what's available. Check out this. There is I've got it on day 36, but there is a blog post series, a developer blog post series that has 30 days of Microsoft Graph. So if you want to kind of gentle your way into it, this is a great way to go. Note the publish date, okay, October 30th, 2018. And like I just said, things are constantly changing. So if something's a little different, don't get frustrated, but it might be worth walking through if this is a tool you feel like you would like to use. So here I am, I'm signed in. I can use, these getting started sample queries right here. I can use show more samples, and you can see some of these things that come up, so I can take a look at what's available to me. Like if I turn on Excel or turn on Planner, right, you see how those things start showing up over here on the side. So all of those things are available to me. Now, for many of these things, we have to make sure we have our permissions set correctly. And what that means is giving the correct permissions to allow this to run. So I don't know what's going to happen here if I click get planner plan. Oh, I need an ID. Okay, I'm going to try get my notebooks. I might have permissions okay for that. Yeah, I do. If you don't have the right permissions for something, what you'll see here is instead of a success, you'll see an error. So if we go and modify my permissions, we're going to take a look at these permissions and how you know, look at all these. How do you know what you need, right? You can see that we've got, the stuff that we've already consented to. So if you execute a call in the Graph API that tells you that the permissions are incorrect, you get a different status code here, you get a little red bar, right? I'm going to try my mail settings one in my other, no, that other window I'm not signed into. That's fine. You get a little red bar, then this is where you go, is into modify permissions to select the permissions. But, how do you know? How do you know what permissions you need? And this is how you know, is in the documentation. So this is the V1 reference. Note up here, V1, and you can change to beta if you need to. Again, I would just default to V1. So let's say I want to go get contacts for someone, which is something I am doing in one of the flows. Right here shows the permissions. I need to have contacts read and contacts write. Now, when you are working in the Graph Explorer, it is using the delegated permissions. So you have permissions to your own stuff, and you have permissions to stuff of a user where the user has delegated permissions to you. In general, that will be no one. Okay, usually that's no one. But you can see there's such a thing as application permissions too, and that's what we'll be setting up the Azure AD application for, is so that we can have these application level permissions. In the Graph API, it's a delegated permissions. However, you can see right here, this, if I wanted to use get contact, this is what I need to have permissions to. Now I know my account already has consented on that because that was one of the initial functions I used. And so we just scroll and we find, and okay, here's contacts. Contacts read write. And so obviously read write includes read. You wouldn't have to select them both, just select the one you need. As always with permissions, select the lowest privilege you need. So if your application is just going to read contacts, you would select contacts read. If you actually need to write, you would select read write. Little point there. So then again, here's another one I'm using in my flow is update mailbox settings. And you can see in order to do that, I have to have mailbox settings read write, and there doesn't seem to be a mailbox setting read. Okay, another link I've included in the slides is the Microsoft Graph Permissions reference. So be sure you check that out. So just because something isn't available over here in the sample queries doesn't mean you can't go ahead and run, whatever you need to, whatever you want to try. And so we can try, we're going to be looking at mailbox settings because I'm setting it out of office, and we can try that. We hit enter, right? And we can see that we get back a response. It's human readable, status is disabled, there's no external audience, there's no internal reply, no external reply. There is a scheduled date and time. However, with it being disabled, that doesn't actually matter. Okay, so you can also, here in the Graph Explorer, you can also use patch and you can use post. So if we go back to our documentation, if we wanted to change those, and we'll look at this a little more closely, we can see down here how we need to do that, and we can also see up here the HTTP request, right? Patch, users, ID or user principal name, and mailbox settings. Okay, so here's how to update mine. Here's how to update someone else's. Okay, so these things that you need for success are right here for you, and you can test them right over here. So this gives you a great ecosystem to figure out, can I do what I need to do? Another point about the Graph API that we're not looking at today is it does have something called subscriptions. I want you to know about that just in case you do get into it. You can actually get back a delta of changes instead of having to get all the data and parse through it and figure out what you need. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. So that's the basics on the Graph Explorer. Get in there, give it a try, don't get frustrated. If it tells you you need permissions, you click on modify permissions over there and off you go. Okay, you'll be firing that thing like crazy and figuring out what's going on in your org. Remember, it's delegated. So we're going to have to create the Azure AD application so that we can access the API. I said as someone other than ourselves. That's not really accurate, but it's so we can get back data aside from just our own, right? Because we don't want, in general, when we're creating a flow, we're not interested in just our data. We don't just want the me stuff, right? If we only access the API with our own account, we only get info about our own items, right? And permissions can be limited, so that's good to know too. Graph Explorer only has the option of using a sample account or using your own authentication credentials. You know, I mean, I guess if you knew your buddy's credentials, you could sign in as them. But what I'm saying is you're really just going to be using the me option of that API unless you have delegated permissions, because you can't set up application permissions there. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to set up the Azure AD application. Like Logic Apps that we looked at last week, this is not scary. It is pretty straightforward. Let me go find it. I conveniently left it all the way over here. Okay, so I have one set up. We're going to take a look at that. But for right now, we'll just go ahead and create a new registration. Okay, we give it a name. And so this I'm going to name Graph API Webinar Demo. Okay, and I think who can use this, or accounts in this organizational directory only. That's correct. That's what I want. Redirect URL. If you need a redirect URI, we're going to talk about this in a minute. You probably don't, but if you do, you can set it up there. And I'm going to go ahead and click the register button. So now that's created. It pops up with an overview. Okay. And that was really fast. And so right here, we have some information we're going to need. It's the application ID and the tenant ID, the directory ID. I want you to notice the parentheticals here. When you're looking at people's blog posts and documentation, application and client get used kind of interchangeably, and directory and tenant get used kind of interchangeably. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. Okay, certificates and secrets. We're going to need a client secret for our authentication. Okay, you can click here, create a new client secret. Please note this expiration. Now, is it more secure to have your client secret expire in a year? Probably so. Are you building something where it may break on you if your client secret expires in a year and you've forgotten about it? Probably so. So you need to make the right decision for yourself. If you've got an expiring client secret, you will want to make sure that you are aware of when that is going to expire. And so I'm just going to name this Graph Secret. I have another one of these already set up that my demos are using, so I don't actually need to copy this or anything, but you can see now it's created. Copy this when you see it. So you'll want to go ahead and just copy it and make a note of it, so you've got it in your for use in your flow, just like the other information here. Do you see the little info at the top? Copy the new client secret value. You won't be able to retrieve it after you perform another operation or leave this blade. Okay, create, then copy, which I'm not going to do because I'm going to throw this thing out. All right, so the next thing we need is we need to set up our API permissions. Look at that. It gave me user read to Microsoft Graph already. Now, we have already talked about permissions. How do we find out what permissions we need? We look at the graph documentation, right? So I know that I'm building something that's going to change somebody's mailbox settings, and I know I need mailbox settings read-write. Now they put it right up here. Will it stay right up here forever? I don't know, but it is here, and that's nice. Okay, now here comes my choice. Delegated permissions or application permissions. What we want is application permissions, because we want to be able to run this from Flow, and we do not want to have to just get the current user's information. Okay, so we're going to have application permissions, and after we select that, look at that, it's got a search, mailbox. Let's see how it does. Look at that, it's got mailbox settings. Now here, it does look like there's a read and a read write. So I would say the documentation is not perfect. However, we know we need that. Let's make sure it's selected. Okay, and now I can hit add permissions. Now, unlike the client secret, when you add permissions, you can go back and add more permissions. You know, you don't have to, this is not a one-stop, you know, one shot, you're done, okay? So it's okay to go back and add more permissions. Now, because it's application, admin consent is required, and you can see it's not been granted. There's two ways to grant that. One way is this giant button sitting right here. I'm going to use that way. The other way that you will find in another document, get administrator consent, involves creating a URL that someone can click that allows them to grant access. If you do it that way, and I just want to make sure we've got this in the recording so you know, if you do it that way, then we do have to have that return URI set. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. Doing it this way is easy peasy. We're going to click grant admin consent. I'm going to say yes, and now you can see I've got a nice green successful. Okay, so that's all set up. I think authentication is where that return goes. And let me just take a quick look at that. And 1 second here. All of a sudden, my Roomba woke up and decided to finish vacuuming the upstairs. Fortunately, I can turn him off from my phone. Okay, sorry about that. So redirect URIs, we had the opportunity to set that up when we started, when we created this, but you may need to set up a redirect URI if you are going to use the authentication method listed here. Okay, so it's just something to know about. Probably don't need it because it was easy enough under API permissions to just click that button to grant access. Okay, so we've got admin consent granted. You can see it shows us granted here. And that is all there is to setting this thing up. You've got your client secret, you've got your application or client ID, you've got your directory ID. That's what we need for our flow. And you've got your permissions. Don't be like me. If your flow fails because of an unauthorized error and you haven't gone back and granted correct permissions, that would be why. So what I had to do yesterday when I was working on this new demo was I had to pop in here, I had to go to API permissions, and then I had to grant permissions for those mailbox settings read write because I had contacts read, user read all, but I did not have mailbox settings read write. So I had to add those, okay? So that's how you set up your Azure AD application. Pretty straightforward stuff. Now to leverage it in Flow, first off, we're going to be using an HTTP action. We're probably going to be using several of them if we're using Patch or Post. It's a premium connector in Microsoft Flow, which is important to know because of pricing changes coming up in October. You may already be using premium connectors and thinking about pricing changes coming up in October, but it's just, you know, I want to point that out. It uses Active Directory OAuth. And I was very confident about this when I wrote this slide a week ago. And then yesterday I learned something new. So this right here is great if you're doing a get. Okay, so if you're doing a get, it's very simple. Get is what? Get is just getting data, right? It is what it says on the tin. So if you're doing a get, very simple. We'll take a look at that. Uses OAuth, Active Directory OAuth. We pass in this information, the tenant, the client ID, and the secret, okay? But if you're using a post, we have to do something else. And finally, you have to parse your own JSON. Now, it's easy to parse your own JSON. I know it doesn't seem like it. I know right now you're like, I don't even want to talk about JSON. But it is easy to parse your own JSON because we can copy the body returned from the request after we run a test version of the flow, and then you just paste it in and let the little JSON parsing action develop the schema from your sample data. You have to do very little work. You run the flow, you do Control A, Control C, Control V. You're done, okay? So don't let parsing JSON stop you. And the reason to parse your JSON is so you've got the nice dynamic content things you can pick in your flow, okay? So here we are finally at the demo. And this demo, this initial one is all gets, and it uses OAuth. And then the second one I want to show you has a patch, okay? And, you know, initially I was like, oh, we'll just build it real quick. But you guys know I've never built anything quickly in my life. And it also strikes me that I want to make sure that I outline the differences in the authentication methods between these two, okay? Because it was really confusing for me, because over here in the Graph API, I could run a patch. I didn't have a problem at all running a patch. I didn't have to do anything special except for make sure my permissions were correct. And then over here in Flow, let's go look at our runs. Over here in Flow, I really struggled, and I ended up reading a number of documents to get it kind of figured out. You know, if we start scrolling down, failed, 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 failed. Right? And so, I did struggle to get the authentication right. Now, I have notes. Again, I've got links in the slides for you. The way I figured it out was starting here at this GitHub post. This person helped me a lot, you know, to anyone who finds this, and perhaps they are noobs too. Okay. Item 2 here is the one that we took care of with the button to grant consent in the Azure Active Directory, so you can skip that. But item 3 here is important. We have to use an application token with our post. So these folks helped. This person helped me a lot. This post helped quite a bit. This post helped. So I've got all those in the slides. So first off, let's take a look at this one. This is the simple one. This one just gets contact data. So if we hit edit on this and we take a look at what's going on, okay, so I used a variable for these. Look, I could have used a compose step for these as well because I'm not changing them. We use, in general, a variable. The idea of a variable is you can change the value, right? Whereas a compose step, once you set the value, it is set and you cannot change your compose step later. Now, in general, this means that if you're doing something like this, where you're just hard coding in a value, you could easily use a compose step. The challenge I have with compose is when you use compose, your output in the dynamic content just says output. The name of the compose step is over it, but the output just says output. And I find that a little less helpful, right? I'm trying to see, let me go show one. I'm gonna click here and just see what shows up here in our dynamic content. I don't have any compose steps here. I'll show you that in the other one. So whereas when we use something like a variable, then what we can do is we can see the name of the variable here. So I named the variable, you know, application ID, and down here, instead of just saying output, it says application ID. So it's worth considering using variables in terms of the nice naming that you get here instead of it just saying output. However, I bounce back and forth on that. Okay, it's not a hard and fast. So what we've got here is our application ID, also known as client ID. Our directory ID, also known as tenant ID. Those things come from, right? Those things come from, come on, here. Right? Application or client ID, directory or tenant ID. That's where those come from. And they're just pasted in. And here is my client secret that I copied when it was created, right? And that's going to expire in 2020. So I need to be aware of that. I'm running a get. So right here, I'm getting all the users. You can see I'm using the v1.0 and I'm getting the users. I do not have any headers here, no body, there's no request content, and I'm using Active Directory OAuth. Here's the authority. Here's the audience, and you can just use your variables here to pass these in. So it's a little easier when you're making multiple calls to use a variable instead of hard coding that in each of these, because if we're making multiple calls, then these don't change, and we don't really want to have to go fix them 42 places when our client secret changes because we let it expire. Here is the parse JSON step. Now here's what I'm talking about. Look at that schema. I did not personally write that because I am way too lazy. Instead, you can use a sample payload to generate the schema. And the way you can do that, and I'm going to go ahead and move on this view back to my contact data. The way you can do that is by looking at a previously run flow. So do your flow up to the step where it makes the HTTP request, right? Don't add steps after that, and just hit run so that it runs through the HTTP request. And then once it has done that, or you can add the JSON step and let it fail. I've also done that. I mean, there's no shame in that. But once your HTTP request is run, you get a body right down here, right? And so what you can do with this body is you just click in here, Control A, Control C, go back over here to your JSON step, use sample payload, Control V, done, and it generates the schema for you. And then when we get down in here, you can see in our dynamic content, we have all of this great stuff from our parse JSON step. We've got mail, we've got given name, we've got ID, surname, user principal name, all the stuff that came back, okay? So if you're making a web request, and if it is returning JSON, and if you want to parse it, so you've got that easy peasy dynamic content, just go ahead and run the step, and then you can copy that out and paste it in, okay? Now, with Graph API, right, I had another option where I could have gotten that from, right? I could go ahead and just run my request right here in the Graph Explorer, copy this out, and go paste it into my JSON payload, sample payload to generate schema. So there's a few ways to take care of that. Okay, so this is one authentication method, and here what I'm doing is I'm doing another get to get the contacts for the given user. So for each user, I pass in the user principal name. You can see what the URL looks like. I'm using v1.0. It's the user's user principal name, contacts. How do you know that? Well, you know it right here, right? Get users, and then ID or principal name. It doesn't go in the curly braces. Those are like indicative of placeholders. Contacts, and then you could add the ID of the contact, but I wanted all of the contacts, okay? And so from here, what I could do is if I wanted to, I could do something with those contacts. And again, you can see I've got OAuth direct, Active Directory OAuth, my authority, it's a secret. I've got all this stuff passed in. Okay, so this is the simple form of authentication you can use for a GET, and it is simple, and I will be exporting this with my client secret and some of the stuff changed, obfuscated, or actually moderately modified so that it's not real anymore. And then I will export this and get you guys a copy just so you can import it and look at it. So I'll include that with the webinar pack. And you can see when you look at the flow, you know, here we come through, we apply to each. Well, this is a dev site, there's only me, right? And you can see here comes my data. And so you can see I've got, you know, here's my test contacts that I've added. And you can copy this out then and use that to generate JSON schema and move on from there with something you want to do with these contacts. So that's a sample of a GET. Now, where things get a little more interesting is if we want to do a patch. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a patch because I wanted to set up this out of office. So, and I'll get you guys this one too. Again, I'll kind of get rid of some of the stuff that's specific to my little dev environment here. I'll probably put in like placeholders, like put your app ID GUID here or something like that, and then I'll get it to you. Hey, have you guys used scopes? If you haven't used scopes, they're nice for kind of, well, they're nice for putting things in a scope. That's useful information. They're nice for grouping, okay? Keep in mind that variable declarations have to be on their own. They have to be top level actions at this point. So if you're using variables, you can't put those in a scope. If you're using compose, compose can go in a scope. And so here you can see, here's a sample of what I'm talking about with using compose. My compose step is named encode client secret, but down here in my get token call, you can see it's just output. If I hover over it, you can see it's the output from encode client secret, but this becomes less meaningful to look at. So let's talk about what I'm doing here. I am getting a token for the authorization I need in order to run this patch statement. I believe, but I have not tested it, that I would need to also use this same approach for a post, okay? And I'm using it for a patch down below, getting token, we use a post. So this blog post right here, which is included, there's a link included, helped me. This helped me a lot because it explained what I need to be setting. And then this also had the information on what needs to be set in the token. Here's the access token stuff on 4. And you can see again, here's the information. You know, you post to this, you got to put your tenant in there. Here's the content type. You got to pass in a client ID. The scope is Graph Microsoft default. Got to pass in your client secret. You got to pass in the grant type. Now, I'm encoding the client secret because you guys saw that client secret. It was not URL encoded. and we are putting it basically in the body of a URL request. Okay, so do encode your client secret. I am not encoding my client secret. How funny. I was encoding my client secret and then I stopped for some reason, and apparently it's still working. So we'll check that because I might have been lying to you. I know that was being URI encoded. Perhaps it failed that way and I changed it. Yesterday was a very confusing day. We'll take a look at that. I don't want to lie to you guys. My URI has my tenant ID in here. You can see my content type. I've got a body type of form data. The grant type is client credentials. Here's the scope, graphmicrosoft.com.default. Here's my client ID. Here's my client secret, which we will find out if it really did need URL encoding, and maybe I'm crazy, URI encoding. Next, I parse the authentication request. Again, you can just, run through this post step, copy out the content, paste it into the schema. Now, our access token has to start with the word bearer and a space. Okay, so it's bearer space access token. This person right here was very helpful in this matter. Okay, and once you've got your access token, then you can use it. Now, I'm using a scheduled flow. It runs every morning at 1 a.m. Does anybody have leave requests today that's approved? If they do, I'm going to set up their out of office. These two compose steps I set up just for my own testing. I wanted to see what the start date really looked like coming back from SharePoint, and I wanted to make sure my format date was matching correctly, because you guys all know when you go and you run your flow, if your condition isn't met, it just gives you true or false. It doesn't show you what the values were that were compared. So sometimes if you're going to run a condition and you're not confident that you know what the values are going to be, it's helpful to temporarily add a couple compose steps in so you can run it and see something. It saves you time when you're testing. So we're still scrolling here, getting the person email. Well, what I'm getting back from my SharePoint list, here's my SharePoint list. I've got a person column here. It's person or group, and I've got the person in here, and I'm getting back their user principal name, and it has that prefix on it, right? And I don't know what's happened to my formulas here because, oh no, I've got the person email. That's right. So yeah, it's not, I do have the person email. I did have a formula here, but then what I found out was that I couldn't find in the dynamic content the person email. So what I had to do here was I had to use a compose step to get the person email, because the person email wasn't accessible to me here in the dynamic content. You know how sometimes they, Flow will hide something you need. Now it's showing up, but it wasn't showing up yesterday. Maybe it's just my dev site. Okay, so I'm using a compose step there. It looks like it's no longer necessary, and that's just fine. I can handle this. Next, I need my JSON body. How do I know what this is supposed to look like? I have two places I can find out, right? I've got this over here when I run my mailbox settings, and I also have over here, I've got information in my documentation where it says, here's your automatic replies settings, right? We click on that and we can see what our automatic replies look like, right? So here's a JSON representation of what this looks like, okay? So I've got two places to find it. This might be the simplest, and the documentation also has it. So now I know what my automatic replies have to look like. So what am I passing in? First off, here's my internal reply message. I'm saying, I'm just going to use the title of the leave request there. And for my external reply message, I'm saying I'm out of the office until blah. Please contact blah with any requests. I look forward to replying to you on my return. I've got to set the scheduled start date and the scheduled end date, and I can use dynamic content for all of that. And finally, I make my patch call. After all of that, we're finally done. We're finally ready, right? And so users, here's my person email from my compose step, which apparently is no longer necessary. And here's my authorization. That's my bearer token that I created up above. And you can see it's got the word that up above when we created it, we added bearer plus the access token that we got back from our request. So here's our access token that says we have permission. It's in our header. And here's our body where we've got the output. And you can see everything else is just authentication none, no cookie. So this is our JSON right there, our JSON body. Okay, so that's what we've got here. I'm not going to save my changes. I don't think I changed anything. I think Flow might disagree. And I'm going to turn it on. And I'm going to hit run. So before I do that, let's go make sure I don't have my out of office set. Now, one thing I had to do was go figure out where to find this. But again, you know, search to the rescue again. I started typing out of office without any spaces and automatic replies showed up. I don't know, it's magic. So you can see automatic replies are turned off right now, and that's great. We could also see that over here in our graph API request, status is disabled, right? What are our possible statuses? Right here, disabled, always enabled, and scheduled. Okay, so we're going here for scheduled. And what have I got in my list? I've got a tech conference that's happening with today as the start date and an end date of September 1st. So we are now finally ready to run this thing. And let's make sure I don't regret that URI encoding step being missing. However, this is how we learn. You guys, I was so excited yesterday. I scared the cat when I finally got this thing to work. I was definitely quite pleased. I don't know if it's some sort of low self-esteem thing that I'm always so surprised when I figure something like that out. I was just amazed. So, all right, now I've got my my flow ran. It succeeded, which is great. There were 2 items for it to go through. So now we can take a look at some of this stuff. You know, we've got our get token. We can see what our outputs were. Here's our bearer token. Here's when it expires. So I think they last an hour. Here's our access token. Here's our actual, you know, what we're going to create in the compose step. Down here in our apply to each. I know the first one is going to not pass the condition, right? And see what I mean? The expression is false. You know, what if I had some problem here where I didn't understand the dates that were coming back from my condition? So that's why I added those 2 compose steps. And if this were something real, not just a demo, I would delete those before it went live. But they're very helpful for your testing purposes because then you don't have to like re-add things. So this time my condition evaluated to true. It ran all these little things. It did my patch. What was happening to me before I got the authentication figured out was I was getting an error here about not having access. So initially I was getting an error about not having access because I had not granted permissions. And then I was getting an error about access because I was not authenticating correctly. So I needed to use an access token in order to be able to do this. So you can see we've got a new scheduled start date time. It's scheduled. It's going external audience all. I've got internal and external reply. Let's send me an email. I've got one all set up. It's going to that mailbox. So we're going to send that email real quick while we take another look at this. You can see our scheduled date time. Scheduled end time. I just got the mail over here, right? And now over here, I'm going to pop this up. Look at that. I got an automatic reply letting me know that this person's out of the office. Contact support. And I don't have another internal user to test the internal bit. And you can also go back and run the Graph Explorer and see what results you have. However, I was seeing yesterday a little bit of a delay on that. And again, you know, some of these things that I'm seeing that have been just a little weird may have to do with the dev environment, you know, like I couldn't find person email in my dynamic content and used a compose step or some of these. So I will clean out unnecessary stuff in the flow, and then I will clean, you know, put in placeholders for some of the stuff that would be specific to you, and I'll export these and have them for you guys with the webinar packet. So does anybody have any questions? I know, as usual, I went way over time. I'm always like so determined that I'm going to make these short and succinct, but then I always want to share all of the details with you all because, you know, some of this stuff is hard to figure out, and it's really fun once you have the information to have the opportunity to share the information, because why would I want anybody else to struggle, right, when this stuff's new to us? So again, you guys know where to reach me. I'm at hillary.stupa@qdabra.com. So if you come up with a question later, you know, let me know. Oh, I do see some questions. So let me, I've got to pop out the question pane because I am not good at GoToMeeting. Can you show how you called the API flow that you had created? How I called it? Oh, I just had a scheduled flow for both of those. So I'm going to type it in here. Both were scheduled. So it was just a matter of, I've got to find the right button. It was just a matter of clicking run. Now, you could do these flows on something. When I started the one on the leave request, I had it set to run when an item was created or modified. And then I quickly realized that that was a bad idea because we probably plan leave in advance, you know, so I might have leave requests for the rest of the year in there, and I don't want to be constantly, you know, overriding them or the last one wins in terms of setting up out of office. It's not like I can set out 15 out of offices in advance. So yeah, they were scheduled. The one that did the out of office mailbox settings was running every morning at 1 a.m., which is plenty of time to go set up those out of office replies for people. Oh, how did I add it to the flow? Okay, let me pop back, sorry, as I answer entirely the wrong question. So in terms of just adding something, adding this to the flow, right? Let's go look at one that we've got in edit mode. In terms of this, the action that we need here is an HTTP request, right? It's this guy right here. So it's HTTP request, and then you just set the method get, you set the URI, and you set anything else you need right there, including any headers. You set your authentication. So it's just an HTTP request. And one thing I also wanted to show you guys while we're here is, if you haven't seen it yet, right, copy to clipboard, okay? So we now have copy to clipboard, and look at this, I can pop over to another flow and edit it. Why did I not just click the edit button there? I can edit it, I can click add, I can add an action, and it's here on my clipboard, right? That parse JSON that I just copied. So keep in mind that you can copy to clipboard now, and you can switch between tabs, which is super beautiful and super great. It also sometimes gives you strange errors if you do something wrong. So like I pasted a variable which can only be at the top level inside of a condition, and I was getting back strange errors when I tried to save my flow. So kind of a heads up on that. All right, come up with any other questions, feel free to email them. I'm going to pay the bills here real quick and tell you about Forms Viewer. It's a great product. It's a great way to go ahead and move forward with your existing InfoPath forms. We've got tons of new features coming all the time. We are getting ready to release 4.2, just got that done in testing, and you can get it in the SharePoint store, so it is easy to get a hold of. So if you have not checked it out, I encourage you to check it out. If you would like a demo, I would encourage you to just drop us a line. We are happy to show it to you and check and see if your forms will work in Forms Viewer. Thank you so much for your time. Take the survey after the webinar, and I will get you guys a webinar pack with these sample flows. Have a fantastic rest of your week.